Welcome to the show. I am your host, Todd Dallas Lamb, and you're listening to On the Clock. On the Clock is a venture with the Strategos Podcast Network, where we feature an array of guests to dive into all things education. We hope you enjoy. Welcome back to On the Clock with Todd Dallas Lamb. I am your host, Todd Dallas Lamb, and today my guest is a superintendent from Pleasanton Unified School District out in California, a friend of mine named David Haglund, superintendent of that district. David, thank you for being on the show. I really appreciate it. How are you today?
Doing great. Thank you, Todd, for thinking of me. It's always good to engage in conversation with friends.
I love it. Well, I'm happy to say that you are in our 1 year of our podcast now, and we've probably done about 15 or 20 of these. You are my first superintendent from my home state of California. So thank you for that. I have a lot of questions, but how is it going out in California now as we are slowly as a country moving into some form of normalcy?
Yeah, it's a bit nuts, as you can imagine. Everybody's been rocked a bit this year, from our parents through our students, through our teachers, even through the leadership team here. But as you say, we've got students back at school. As of Monday, all of our students will be on campus 4 days a week, with the exception of those people who have chosen to stay in remote learning. So there's lots of complexity in the model that we're running forward right now, but I don't think that's all that different than some of the others in California as well.
I'm sure. And so I know a little bit about your area. I grew up in California. Tell our listeners a little bit about Pleasanton. I would dare say that it's of one of the nicer areas in the entire Bay Area. If you're familiar with San Francisco, it's over across the bay in the the Oakland side of the Bay Area. It's an incredibly nice area. There's a lot of wineries out that way. Tell me a little bit more about Pleasanton than I already know.
Sure. So Pleasanton is definitely a bedroom community for Silicon Valley. Many of the families that we have, parents work in some of the larger tech companies across the Bay. We have about 14,500 students in pre-K through adult education. We're a very high-performing district and have been for a long time. Number one performing school district in Alameda County, and I think we're number 11 in the state of California. So the great teachers, great families, great programs. But even in communities like Pleasanton, the COVID virus didn't spare us from a lot of the pain that everybody else has been feeling. Well, but it's a beautiful, beautiful community, lots of green, lots of foothills to go hiking in, and a very active community, well-educated and active community, I guess I would say it that way.
I have a friend who's a superintendent who just left a district in New Jersey a few years back where he had a large Asian community, a majority Asian community. And his challenge was getting books to the parents during the summertime so that the kids could read them in advance of the fall. And then he's moved down south to an entirely different type of district with different educational expectations. And it's always fascinating to me how different our country is from state to state, even from county to county within a state. I know that your background is that you were deputy secretary in Santa Ana. And I don't know that most people understand the differences that a superintendent such as yourself can experience with the different communities that are available to you in America with regards to education and expectations and the challenges that you have. Talk about those differences.
So, yeah, prior to being here in Pleasanton, I was deputy superintendent in Santa Ana Unified School District, which is the sixth largest school district in the state. It's 98% English learner, 96% free and reduced lunch, which is the polar opposite of Pleasanton. And so, what's common in communities is that they love their kids. Yep. There's really no difference with that regard. So the parents in Santa Ana love their kids just as much as the parents in Pleasanton do. But the resourcing in the community is very, very different between the two.
So talk about that for a second. I mean, I think a lot of people throw the word equity out, and I don't know that a majority of people really have a in the weeds understanding of what that really means. Talk about that from the perspective of your two stints in those two different districts.
Yeah, so from a couple of different perspectives, so parents advocate for their children in different ways. In Pleasanton, if parents are upset and they want to advocate for something, they'll likely show up with, because of the resources, many times they'll show up with an attorney. In Santa Ana, they would show up with their friends, and that's how they would advocate, because they're a big family community down there. And so, but the intensity of the advocacy is really no different. It's just the strategies that are deployed are different in the different communities. And so from an equity perspective, there's a great deal of resources in the community of Pleasanton. Most of the families are doing just fine. We do have a free and reduced lunch population, but it's down at about 7%. We have 16% of our students qualify for supplemental funds in the state's funding mechanism. And so that's unique to California, the local control funding formula. And that speaks to how funds are distributed to districts based on their student demographics. And so Pleasanton, being a well-resourced community, actually gets far less funds from the state than Santa Ana did, having a large supplemental and concentration population. Unduplicated count is what it is, the lingo in California. In Santa Ana, that district receives far greater funding for their students. And that was Governor Jerry Brown's attempt to try to really force the management of the equity issues in education across the state. And so Santa Ana would be considered a winner. Oakland would be considered a winner. And districts like Pleasanton or San Ramon up here in the Bay Area, or even Irvine down in Southern California, would be considered LCAP losers, so to speak. They didn't get the same amount of funds.
The K-12 industry, it goes through all these phases where there's a buzzword every 2 or 3 years that really sticks. And right now, I would say that learning loss is the leader in the clubhouse as far as educational buzzwords.
Yeah,
I think we all understand about the population in Santa Ana, which may not have had in this time access to high-speed internet access. What does learning loss mean in Pleasanton for your students? And how are you able to gauge that? Are you assessing and making some determination as to what that has meant?
Yeah, certainly we are making every attempt to understand what the impact of remote learning and isolation and whatnot has had on our community. I'm not a big fan of the concept of learning loss. I mean, what are we comparing it to? I mean, every kid in the state of California is on the same, we're moving at the same rate of speed in terms of, instruction that's been delivered. And so I don't know that a good friend of yours and a good friend of mine, Rick Miller, used to always say, kids are always learning. The question is, what are they learning? And so the reality is that our kids have been learning a whole lot during the pandemic, but it may not be the same progression in terms of mathematics or language arts, but they have learned a heck of a lot. So our kids have learned tons about technology use skills. And as you know, districts have struggled, not just in California, but across the United States, embedding the technology standards into the instructional programs, because they would always compete with the standards of proficiency related to mathematics or language arts or science or whatnot. But in this particular case, everybody was forced to pay attention to them. And so in some ways, we've made huge gains with regards to the use of technology and the integration of technology into the instructional program. So certainly not learning loss in that regard. But maybe there is in mathematics and language arts if we compare the trajectories that students made last year to this year. But if you compare our students to students in a different district or in a different state, I don't know that there's a big gap between the two. And so I think we need to really be wise about how we approach that concept, especially in our community where the pressure is heavy for students to achieve at a very high level. And they haven't had access to the things that they had access to in the past. And so, we need to spend time here really paying attention to helping kids re-engage with school as schools reopen, because there have been consequences that don't have anything to do with math in terms of students' lives, the social emotional learning, the mental health issues that have arisen because of the isolation that was caused by the pandemic. So there's a whole lot of other things that in my mind we need to get a hold of those things before we worry too much about whether or not we're exactly where we need to be with the mathematics scores. And that's just an example.
I have a sappy dream that there's actually a group of students that have prospered during this time, that there are parents who've spent more time with their kid because they've had to be home. Yep. and looking over the shoulder and understanding and seeing in real time how quickly their students are picking things up.
Yep.
I think there's a weird positive from all of this, don't you?
Yeah, I don't think that's a dream. I could introduce you to real people, both students and parents, who could tell you stories about the positives that have come out of the isolation. And in some ways, in this community, which is like I said, it's a high performing and high speed, so to speak, community. It slowed everybody down, and it returned focuses to families in a lot of ways. And, they spent more time with each other. They did more talking with each other. They did more collaborating with the work that students were trying to accomplish. So from that perspective, I think there were many positives to it. Do we want to do it again? No. I'm glad they reconnected. I want them to keep it up, but we need to get kids back in school and reconnected to their, to the learning trajectories that they're on.
I'm fascinated to know what your thoughts are on the federal funding that's coming down. That's the other conversation that's going on right now in K-12, is that there's a waterfall of federal money coming. What are you doing with that money? How much are you expecting? Are you addressing things that maybe looked to be shortfalls for you during the last year? So
yes and no. We do not have a large Title I contingent in our district, so the amount of federal funds we get compared to an Oakland, so to speak, is minuscule. And so we appreciate the additional federal dollars, and they will be applied to continue to mitigate risk with regards to the pandemic. We've used it as those funds, the federal funds, to ensure that all of our teachers and staff members have proper PPE. We've redone our HVAC systems in large measure. We've been able to get some construction projects taken care of that included cracking the painted windows so windows could be open, so, there was just a ton of stuff that we were able to accomplish in short order, largely because the students weren't on campus. So we could bring in construction crews into a campus, didn't have to be on the weekends or at night. So we were able to move some things forward. And some of the federal funds helped with that. Same thing with the state funds. We were able to allow teachers to get the technology that they needed to teach remotely. We had passed a bond in 2016, so those dollars started coming in the 2017-18 timeframe. And part of those dollars were geared towards improving the quality of the 21st century classroom in our schools, which were fairly old and not very well taken care of. And so we had already been upgrading our network system and buying devices for teachers and students. And so in a really weird way, we were very well set up, not intentionally, for that transition to remote learning. We literally closed school on Friday and then opened back up in full remote learning, not the Monday after the weekend, but the next Monday. So we took 1 week to train teachers and provide additional curriculum supports to teachers, and to ensure that every student had a Chromebook and wireless access at their home. So we turned it over in a week. And the teachers did incredible work to be able to do that. And we were able to ensure that every kid had a device and a working internet connection in their home.
What is your assumption as to students who are going to want to stay home going forward?
There are going to be some, and you have experience with me in Riverside, and so we had been talking and moving towards a virtual academy for a bit of time up here, but there just wasn't the demand. This put the throttle down on that concept, and so we will walk out of the pandemic with a virtual learning academy, which is where those students and families will have an option. It's not my intention to continue doing this crazy hybrid, remote, concurrent learning thing for our community next year. It was in a crisis, it worked, and everybody worked their backsides off. But I don't think I'll talk about myself. I don't think I could sustain another year of that.
Right. I know a lot of your brethren out and sisters in your industry have left at what seems to me kind of a record level of retirements.
Yep, it's been brutal. It really has been brutal. And although California, it seemed that California was being pretty aggressive and consistent with their approach to things, it really wasn't that way, because every county had their own guidance when this whole thing started. And so the state would, give recommendations, say everybody go home, but not tell everybody what that looks like or what has to happen in order for you to come back. And so it took us a long time really to advocate to get the state and the counties to become aligned in the way that they're approaching this. Because, there's a lot of counties up here in the Bay Area. And so our teachers live in one county and teach in this county, many of them. Their kids go to school in a different county, but they work in this one. And so there was so much confusion that drove because of different guidelines in those two different counties. And so we really worked with our legislators and with the governor's office to push them to have a united approach. And they finally gotten to that place. Just in time for us to shut, school down for summer.
Unless you've been to California, you don't realize that like a county can be a 2-hour drive. I mean, it is such an enormous state.
In some areas of the state, right? But in the Bay Area, if there's no traffic, you could go through 6 counties in 45 minutes.
Give us, David Haglund, we always like to talk about popular culture and food. Uh-oh. And in your case, I'll even add college football. So I got 3 things for you to finalize our call. And thank you for joining us. So USC football, I have a vibe that it's getting better and they're recruiting better. Are you following that?
Yeah, I would agree that that's true. It's been a rough patch since the Pete Carroll times, but
it has. But I think they're getting there. I think you're getting there. And then tell our folks. One of the things I love to do as you know, I travel to a lot of districts around the country. Give me a place to eat in Pleasanton. So
I'm going to tell you about Sidetrack. Sidetrack is a newer restaurant. It's been around for a couple of years. It's owned by Todd. It's nice little, good lunch spot, good dinner spot, good food, creative menu. But more important than any of that man is a huge supporter of the students in this district.
Oh, that's great.
He commonly shuts his restaurant down or cordons off portions of the restaurant for fundraisers to take place. And just having someone in the community that cares as much about kids as you do, he's a good partner.
That's funny. You'd mentioned earlier that with the students that were gone for a while, you had the opportunity to do renovations. I have a restaurant in Annapolis that just did the same thing. They said, okay, we've got some period of time. Let's go ahead and do some things we've been wanting to do, but we could never do it. He also, in our town of Annapolis, Harry Brown's, he helps out with some local schools and actually feeds kids, which I know that feeding some kids during this time period and their families has been a huge role of the schools, an amazing contribution that schools have provided, through the summer of this pandemic and through the year.
Yeah. And I think, Todd, just for an opportunity to give some shout outs to some of our staff that don't often get recognized. The child nutrition services workers and our custodians, they never shut down. So they kept serving meals even during that week when we were fully closed. They were at schools delivering meals in a safe way, obviously. And they've not stopped since then. So our classified staff members really have been the rock stars in this past year through the pandemic. Our teachers have been wonderful and our parents have been awesome, but we could not have done this without our classified staff.
You know, it's weird. In a weird way, I think that in the last year, schools have gotten back to what they were originally conceived to do, which was to not just educate students, but to be an incredible community resource on like so many levels. I don't think schools get enough credit for that over the years. And I think it's really been highlighted in the last year.
Oh, I would agree with you on that.
All right. Final question. Favorite education movie?
Favorite education movie? That's really weird question, and I know you told me ahead of time you're going to ask it to me, so I should have a good answer. But I'm going to say something that's really not a great education movie, but it's something that everybody should watch. But if you've seen the show Bad Education, that movie is important for people to see. So I don't know that it's a feel-good education movie.
Sure.
And the exact opposite of that, probably. But it really talks about the potential for misuse and fraud in the educational system, and it opened my eyes to some stuff. So that's a great one.
I got to tell you, I appreciate that, because I think a lot of parents are reevaluating education in the last year like I've never seen before, and so you can't know what's good until you see what's bad. So I do appreciate that. Where do I find that? Is that a Netflix?
Yeah, I believe it was on Netflix.
David Haglund is the superintendent of Pleasanton Unified School District out in California, doing some great things out there. I really appreciate your time, David. Tell our listeners how they might be able to get a hold of you, whether it be through your regular email or your Twitter account.
Sure. I can be reached via email at dhaglund, Haglund, at pleasantonusd.net, or at PUSD on Twitter, or at HagDogUSC on Twitter. Both accounts work.
Well, enjoy the rest of your school year, David, and we look forward to talking to you again real soon. Thank you so much.
Yeah, good talking to you, Todd.
You bet. If you want to learn more about the show, please visit www.strategosgroup.com. Please consider subscribing on your podcast streaming platform so you don't miss out on our next episode. And until next time, I'm Todd Dallas Lamb, signing off.